Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. This year marks 30 years since the tragic federal siege of the Mount Carmel Center just outside of Waco, Texas, that was home to the religious group the Branch Davidians. On February 28, 1993, federal and Texas law enforcement raided the compound. It was a failed raid as the Branch Davidians were heavily armed themselves. They killed 4 agents. Several inside the compound also died. It led to a 51-day standoff that garnered national attention. Then in the early morning of April 19, 1993, federal agents sent in armed vehicles, filled the buildings with tear gas, and began firing their guns. Some within the buildings fired back. Eventually, the buildings were engulfed in fire. All of it broadcasted live on television. When it was over, 76 Branch Davidians, including 25 children, 2 pregnant women, and its leader, David Koresh, were dead. My guest today was one of 2 religious scholars who went to Texas as the events unfolded and attempted to communicate with David Koresh on the same radio station that Koresh himself appeared on, and wanted to communicate about religious scriptures in an attempt to bring the standoff to a peaceful end. It appeared it was about to work until the armored vehicles rolled in on that fateful day of April 19th, 1993. My guest is James D. Tabor. James Tabor is a biblical scholar, a retired professor of Christian origins and ancient Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is the co-author of the book called Why Waco, Cults and the Battle for Religious Freedom in America. It was co-authored with Eugene Gallagher. You can also find his work online at jamestabor.com, as well as his YouTube videos where he has a number of talks about this history. James Tabor, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Glad to be with you, Mitch. Thank you. A sad subject, but we need to cover it.
Well, it's interesting. This year will mark 30 years since this occurred. The actual anniversary day had already passed. Many television stations and networks have produced fresh documentaries marking that 30-year anniversary. The story you tell about what happened near Waco, Texas, wasn't in Waco, it was just outside of Waco. The story you tell was actually quite different than even, I was a kid when this happened, but quite different than my recollection of it and my understanding of it that was just consumed from mass media ever since. Did you find that these newer number of documentaries that aired, a couple months ago, marking the anniversary, told a different story than what had normally been told?
Yeah, I've watched, I think there are 5 altogether, as I recall, 4 or 5, and I participated in a couple of them. They're always mixed. It seems like the thing that they always do is try to be objective, but end up maybe by wanting to tell both sides, they lean one way or the other. It's very difficult not to do that because people have passionate feelings. And if you start with the assumption that many do, that this is a crazy, brainwashed, deluded cult led by a crazy, deluded maniac, David Koresh, and don't know anything about their history or background or even the people that were there, it's easy to caricature it as a dangerous group, heavily armed, storing weapons, maybe planning to do harm to Americans in that area or elsewhere. And so it gets slanted that way versus taking more the side of how it would have felt to be inside. So the different films and documentaries tend to go both ways. I actually liked the Dowdle Brothers. It was done on the 25th anniversary. It's Paramount Pictures. They have 2 now. One is just called Waco. It's a 6-part scripted, acted series with Taylor Kitsch, Michael Shannon, and so forth. And, it's somewhat fictionalized. David Thibodeau, one of the survivors of the fire, a Branch Davidian, he was a consultant on it. I was a consultant on it. I even have a tiny little acted part in it where somebody plays me at one point, actually about the radio program that you mentioned. And I thought that was good. And now currently showing, I think it's on HBO, but it's still Paramount, is Waco, the Aftermath. And that's really worth watching as well, because that flashes back and kind of tells the whole story of even who these people were and why they were there and what their history is, because they have a long history going back to the 1930s. So there's so many issues that get tangled up when particular television programs decide to cover Waco, usually in an hour. And I would rate, of the five I saw, just one of them, it was produced by the Brits, ITV. I thought it was pretty decent, pretty well done. But they all have their virtues and their vices. I don't think there's been anything yet that's been done right. In fact, I'm working with some producers on maybe telling the whole story, not just, the Branch Davidian side or the government side, but as much truth as we know, because many, many things are misstated and some things we're not sure of. I think you might have mentioned on April 19th, the day of the final attack or assault, even though the FBI said this is not an assault as tanks were knocking the place down, that there was shooting that the FBI shot. That's one of the controversies, because the FBI claims they didn't shoot a single shot, and there's others that have presented evidence that they did. So you get into that kind of thing. Who started the fire? Was it a suicide cult? So I'll tell you what I know. I'll be as factual as I can about it, but I can't really recommend any of those. But the Dowdle brothers, the two brothers that produced the film, it's actually the series on Paramount Pictures, and you can look it up. It's called Waco. Very easy to find. It was on Netflix for a while.
Your book, again, called Why Waco, was published in 1995, so this is just a couple of years after the event itself had occurred. You begin with a quote in front of the book by Tom Wolfe: "A cult is a religion with no political power." Again, this book, in a couple of years, will be marking its own 30th anniversary since publication, but I suspect that, quote, "a cult is a religion with no political power," was important then for you and is still important today.
It really is. Whenever we, in the academic study of religion, we call it religious studies at every major university, these are secular departments that do a scientific, historical, academic approach to all religious traditions. And one of the things we've tried to put forth to our students, to the public, through books, through interviews, is that the word cult should really be dropped because of its definitional problems. Of course, I have an easy way of illustrating that because I teach early Christianity. And if you begin to describe a cult, as people would typically do, a charismatic leader that demands absolute allegiance of his followers, that tells them to leave father, mother, brother, sister, to sell their property, to enter the group, and the end is near, and to give up everything for the cause. Am I describing David Koresh, or am I describing Jesus of Nazareth? So you see the point. So one person's cult is another person's sincerely held religion. And what we have to talk about, if we want to understand what happened at Waco, there are two things we have to understand: how the government acted and why those people were there, and why didn't they surrender? Why didn't they come out? In other words, what were they involved in? What was their allegiance? But the use of the word cult it's almost like the N-word. It's a kind of religious, prejudicial word. The best illustration I could give you of that is the day after the fire, President Bill Clinton held a press conference outside in the Rose Garden. Very sober day because of the people that had been killed that day, the day before, by the fire, still smoldering. And he says at one point, I'm paraphrasing, well, maybe this can serve as a warning to those who would be tempted to join cults. And what I thought when I heard that, I was not surprised, but kind of appalled, because what it implies is that maybe the government or some responsible agency, should we have a department of religion in the government that could say, well, here are the religions that are safe and harmless and we approve of, but this list over here, they're forbidden religions. You can't be part of these. And in our system, thank God, we don't do that. And I understand why he said it. And it's easy to cast the Branch Davidians as this crazy brainwashed group. But I have, even on my YouTube channel, interviews with, I think it's 19 of them, that was done during the siege. They sent out a videotape, and the FBI did not release it to the public. And when they were asked in congressional hearings, why didn't you release that to the public? They said, well, we felt it would cause widespread sympathy for the group. I couldn't believe it, because I didn't know why they didn't release it, because I didn't even know it existed until after it was all over. But if anybody watches that, you'll see these are rational people. Wayne Martin had a degree from Harvard University. He was one of the first law students to ever graduate from Harvard as an African American. Steve Snyder had an advanced theology degree. You know, he read biblical languages, had studied at seminary. That was David's right-hand assistant. I could name other people. But as you listen to them, you'll see that the reason they were there is because they were students of what they call the Seven Seals. And basically, we can go into that as you wish to, either now or later. But let's just stay with cult for a minute. So what I think we have to do, and we encourage this, is talk about old religions and new religions, because some of the old religions that are perfectly acceptable, churches on every corner in major cities, can be pretty abusive from a more secular viewpoint. For example, teaching little children that there's heaven and hell, and yes, this is literal. And this would be true in many, many evangelical churches, many Roman Catholic churches, although today I think many Roman Catholic churches are more liberal than that. But kind of enforcing certain rules of morality and of behavior with threats of eternal punishment and so forth, that also could be seen as pretty damaging to people. But what we've said in this country is that anyone can believe anything they want in terms of religion. There's a complete separation. The government makes no laws regarding the free exercise of religion or practice thereof in the Constitution. So we all go with that. Now, if someone then breaks laws, it's not because of the religion that they would be pursued or prosecuted or questioned. It's because of their behavior. So, for example, in the case of David Koresh, I mean, there's no question. There's a good case that he was with underage girls, women or girls really, as young as 12, 13, 14 years old, and married them. A couple of the marriages were legal, but when I say a couple, it makes them illegal, because polygamy is also a crime in the United States and certainly in Texas. And so he would be breaking the law, but the BATF, that's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, has no jurisdiction over that. And so it kind of begs the question to say, well, this particular religious leader, he's an adulterer, or he molested children, or he does this or he does that, and talk about what agency of the government would handle that, and certainly not the agency in charge of firearms. So the whole confrontation was supposedly over firearms.
That they had illegal weapons.
Exactly. And let me talk about that in just a minute. So what I want to give you is the alternative to using the cult word, because it doesn't help us to use it. Like, how did you decide that was the label for that group? And if you ask Christians, would you give that to Jesus? They would say, oh, of course not, because he was the true Messiah. You see where we're going here. as if other people who have their views of who was the Messiah, including in Jewish history, people, a whole culture that didn't largely accept Jesus of Nazareth, but other different figures in Jewish history have claimed to be the Messiah. So what we tend to do is just describe what it is. Nomenclature is so important. I also wrote a book called A Noble Death, Suicide and Martyrdom in the Ancient World. And that has to do with a similar problem. I'm just using it as an illustration. What we say in our culture is somebody commits suicide. It's equivalent to commit murder. You see, you commit adultery. It's a thing you do that's wrong. And it's already judged by the term. It was judged as suicide. So the book, A Noble Death, that I wrote with my colleague Arthur Droge, that explores how in the ancient world you would tend to just describe what the person did. So we have heroes in a military context that go on, quote, suicidal missions, but nobody says they committed suicide. And then the whole debate about end-of-life treatments and what should be allowed and not allowed also comes in. And so cult is kind of like the word suicide. Suicide wasn't even used until the 18th century, and it became a theological thing, not just a description, how somebody died rather than which I would prefer. So with religion, we say things like it's a high-demand religion. Well, you can name quite a few high-demand religions. How about Catholicism in the 1950s? Was it a cult? It was pretty high demand. Most Catholic kids were pretty well told what to do, especially if they went to Catholic schools. Also, that there's often a charismatic leader or to whom the group is supposed to give allegiance. That's almost always the case when a group first starts. It's usually started by a guy or a gal, and they often claim a lot of authority and so forth. So I think the way to handle it is just to describe to describe a group. We have a journal called New Religious Movements, and it explores all kinds of religious traditions and the diversity of the United States. And they all have the right to exist. And if they break the laws, then they're accountable for that. So that's kind of our safety net, the law. And the law is what we have to be talking about when we talk about Waco.
Who were the Branch? Who were the Branch Davidians? This is a group that was not started by David Koresh.
No, he's a real latecomer. He got there in the early 1980s, I think around 83 or 4. So 10 years before the end, he showed up. He was a young guy. He was born in 1959. The group started in 1930 by a Seventh-day Adventist layperson. His name was Victor Hodoff. I believe he was Bulgarian, an immigrant. And he was in California, where the Adventists are very strong. And just briefly, without going into 100 years of history, Seventh-day Adventists started in the 1840s and 50s, so going back 100 years before him. And they keep the Sabbath day, the seventh-day Sabbath, the so-called Jewish Sabbath. And so they're called Seventh-day Adventists, means they think the end of the age is coming very soon. They have a history of expectation that stretches over 100 years. And each time they've thought that they had it all figured out, like a lot of apocalyptic groups, they work out interpretations of the book of Revelation and so forth. And they think they're very near the end and they can get ramped up. The way Adventists are today is much more adjusted to the possibility that maybe the Advent is coming in our lifetime, but maybe it isn't. Advent meaning the second coming of Jesus. But there are also lots of non-Adventist groups. Prophecy belief in America is very big. Just go on YouTube, if you dare, type in Antichrist, Book of Revelation, and you'll You won't believe all that's out there. Thousands and thousands of people, with their own interpretation of the signs of the end, Armageddon, and so forth. I think you interviewed Bart Ehrman recently. He's written about that. Just why is this so ubiquitous, and particularly in the United States, but all through history, it's been that way. And so if you start talking about David Koresh in 1993 and the Waco tragedy, you really need to understand a bit of that background. That's just the Seventh-day Adventists for way over 100 years. But also Victor Hodoff. And he broke from the Adventists. He was basically kicked out because of his views. And what he believed is that they were allegorizing prophecy too much. They would read a prophecy about Israel and say it was the church. The church is Israel. It's symbolic. Jerusalem is spiritual Jerusalem. It's not the city of Jerusalem today. And Hodoff was very big on the idea that if you open Isaiah 2, which is one of the main prophecies in the book of Isaiah in the Bible, talks about Jerusalem will become the center of the world and all nations will come up to Jerusalem and learn the way of God and so forth. A kind of Christian millennialism idea, the reign of the kingdom of God on earth. Well, the Adventists don't teach that. They think they're going to go up to heaven and Satan's going to be down here on earth. But Hodoff began to take more of the mainstream evangelical view that no, there's all these prophecies in the Bible that talk about the reestablishment of Israel, Jerusalem being under Jewish control. That's what's fired a lot of modern prophetic belief, is 1948, the establishment of the state of Israel, which would be interpreted to have fulfilled these prophecies to some degree, or at least the beginning. And he also, of course, is keeping the Sabbath and so forth. But he was the leader. I wrote this down because I don't have it all memorized. Let's see. He died in 1955, so he had about a 20-year period. And his wife took over, Florence, young girl that he had married. And they're not even on the property that we know today as, the Mount Carmel Center. They're nearby in Waco on the lake. So they call that Old Mount Carmel. The buildings are still there. They're quite substantial. They're brick, permanent buildings that he built. Hodoff was very successful. Thousands of followers, had radio program and so forth. And so once he died, the group was very weakened because everyone thought, well, he's leading us and he'll live to see the end. So when the charismatic leader of any apocalyptic group dies, it's a crisis. Florence, though, took over, the wife, and she was appointed by the board to lead the group. And she determined that the end would come in 1959. So I think it was March or April of 1959. That would be 4 years after the death of her husband. They had a gathering at the Old Mount Carmel Center. It was several hundred people. It was covered by the news. I have some news footage on my YouTube channel of that day. People might be interested in getting the feeling of it, where the news reporters are coming out. You've got this end of the world group. Nothing about arms, nothing about anybody having more than one wife, nothing at all that would parallel David Koresh. But anyway, they call it the Great Disappointment, and it was. Nothing happened. And there was this feeling of, well, we really blew it. And instead of resetting the date, which usually happens with these groups, Florence just disappeared. She went to California. I think she remarried. She ended up part of another religious group. But there was a couple, Ben and Lois Roden, in the 1950s, who took on the leadership, almost like passing the baton. And he claimed, Ben, the male, claimed to be a prophet. And later, when he died, Lois claimed to be a prophet. And they would bring new revelation. And what you have to understand about the Adventists, and this really is crucial for knowing about David Koresh, is that they believe in what they call present truth. And they believe in the last days, God will send a series of prophets. So their interpretation is that the founder of the Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen G. White, was the first. The second was Hodoff. This is the Davidian view. The third was Ben Roden, and then Lois Roden. And by their calculations, there's one still to come. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 10, any of your listeners can just get a Bible and look it up. You'll see this seventh messenger talked about. And that's what David Koresh claimed to be, or who he claimed to be. He began to say, after Lois died particularly, I believe I have received the gift of prophecy. I'm going to pick up that baton all the way back to Hadaf, to the Rodens, to him. And the way he would demonstrate his prophetic ability was by interpreting the scriptures, particularly the book of Revelation, last book of the New Testament. And so in that chapter 10, an angel appears and has a little book, a scroll. And the little book is then sealed, and the visionary, his name is John, who writes the book of Revelation. We don't know which John it is. Some people think it's John the Apostle. It could be other Johns we know of that time, but a follower of Jesus, obviously. And he's told to seal the book and not to reveal it until the end. And then the seventh messenger comes, and Koresh claimed to be that messenger. And it says that all of the mysteries of the prophets will be made known. So that's what David Koresh began to claim. He was kind of a biblical savant. Since a kid, he was just obsessed with reading the Bible, memorizing the Bible. He's reading the King James Version. I would loosely say he had it memorized, and by memorize, I don't mean you could just randomly open 2 Chronicles 3:2 or something, and he would quote it like, Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man or something like that. It wasn't that kind of savantism, but just this pretty amazing ability to synthesize hundreds and hundreds of texts together, particularly the Psalms, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Daniel, which predicts the end of the age and gives all kinds of chronology, and the book of Revelation. So this is something, a lot of people don't know. Isaac Newton, the great physicist, he was more interested in the book of Daniel and Revelation than he was physics. He says that in his diary. He's trying to figure out these numbers, these prophetic numbers of 1,260 years and 1,290 years and 1,335 years. And if you count right, where do you come out? So Koresh then believed he was this final messenger. Then the messengers told, eat the book, eat it. So it's sealed and he eats it. And what that symbolizes is that he has totally absorbed it and now can tell people what those 7 seals were. So what Koresh's claim to fame, and he mainly attracted Seventh-day Adventists, was saying, who can open the book with the 7 seals? And that was what he claimed. And so, for example, David Thibodeau, that I know really well, one of the survivors, I mentioned him earlier, he said, we didn't even call ourselves Branch Davidians. That's a name that goes back to the time of Hadaf and Roden. We called ourselves Bible Students of the 7 Seals. They're not really a denomination or a formally organized group. It's people who came to what they call the Mount Carmel Center. The FBI called it a compound, so you see how the language is getting used right away. I mean, there's no wall around it. Normally you think of a compound as like, the Kennedy compound. And
I think I refer to it as a compound, I think, in my introduction.
No, I think you might have said Carmel Center.
I did say Carmel Center, but I think later on.
Maybe you said both.
Or anyway, at least in my original
that's just
draft.
Out there, it's you're not going to remove that any more than the word cult or whatever. But they certainly didn't think of it as a compound. And if you interview people like Sheriff Jack Hartwell, he testified before Congress when I did. By the way, my congressional testimony is also on YouTube. Anybody can watch that. 30 years ago, you'll see a different James Tabor, but I was pretty passionate because it was fresh. It was 2 years after it happened. But anyway, basically, Jack Hartwell said, I've gone out there many times. Picture Texas culture. Let's sit on the front porch and drink iced tea and talk about how hot it's going to be this summer and that kind of thing. This is the culture of Waco outside, even the city. It's a friendly town. It's a small town. So Jack Harwell, he said in his interviews with the Congress, he said, I love those people. They were wonderful people. He said they wouldn't have harmed anybody. They were peaceful. He even said they were clean. They were upstanding, and they have the right to their beliefs about the Bible, and they shouldn't be disturbed. Now, that's quite in contrast to the idea that they are a gun-hoarding, apocalyptic group that have in mind some sort of violent attack on the culture of some type. So that's the kind of thing that you get into when you discuss Waco, taking these two polarities. But I can tell you, for us to talk here about the message, what did David really teach and what were those 7 seals? That has to be central because that's why the people were there. They believe that David had showed them mysteries of the scriptures that have to do with their salvation. And people have heard David claim to be God or David claim to be the Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. Yes, he claimed to be a Messiah. But they worship Jesus Christ. It is a Christian group. And David felt that he was anointed by God as the final messenger. And then he could go through all these scriptures. One of the major ones is Psalm 40, where it talks about a Messiah. And yet that Messiah says, my sins are more than the hairs of my head. And David would say, well, who's that? Is that Jesus of Nazareth? Is he a sinner? And everybody's like, no, that couldn't be him. Well, who is it? Because that's the one who destroys Babylon. I wonder who that could be. He would teach like that. I've listened to thousands of hours of him talking, all the negotiation tapes. I got to know what he taught pretty well. Also talked to a lot of people since about and studied, and also tapes that he gave. So they called it the message of present truth. And that's why they were there. And they believed that God had led them there, and they were in the last days. The Gulf War was very important. Talking about the first Gulf War. I have an article on my website, jamestabor.com, in which I go through David's interpretation of the Gulf War. And it's from the book of Daniel. And it says things like, this is Daniel, that the king of the north will attack the king of the south. Saddam Hussein attacks Kuwait. You see what they get into. And then a great army from the south will come up of many nations. George Bush Sr. and the allies attacking Iraq and so forth and so on. So they were pretty sure they were right at the end, and basically studying the 7 seals, and David would open one of the seals, and the first one is a rider on a white horse. Everybody thinks it's Jesus. And he would try to convince you that can't be Jesus. Jesus is in chapter 19. He's not in chapter 6, where the rider so who's the rider on the white horse? Well, he thought it was him. He also said, I'm the lamb, which for most Christians is like, what? You can't be the lamb? Jesus is the lamb. But in Greek, there's a different word for lamb in the book of Revelation than there is elsewhere when it talks about Christ as the Passover lamb. It's a different word. And so, and he would say, well, Jesus didn't open the 7 seals. He sealed the 7 seals and said the 7th messenger would open them. So you see, there's this sort of internal logic. I'm not convinced by it. I mean, I even could argue against it and bring up counterpoints, and I wish I'd had a chance to meet David and discuss with him, and we can talk about, as we have time, how Phil Arnold and I proposed that the thing could be ended, and the FBI did work with us. They sent our materials in.
Yes.
And it basically had to do with convincing David that he had a very small audience before February 28th. Who knew about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians? 130 people living in outside Waco, Texas at this Mount Carmel Center. Nobody ever heard of that. Who knew about David Koresh on March 1st? The whole world. All the media of the world came. Now we're focusing on this guy. Can you imagine what that meant to the Davidians? I mean, they didn't want the attack, and they thought it was wrong. And there were people killed, 6 of them and 4 BATF agents and others wounded, including David Koresh was wounded that day. But they saw it as self-defense. You know, in Texas, if you come driving up in cattle cars armed like a SWAT team, and then there's this discussion of what happened, and we don't have to go into all that, you know, who shot first and everything. But basically, from the Davidian point of view, we were attacked by Babylon. Babylon's the symbol for the evil powers of the government that want to kill you in the end times. And so they defended themselves. But basically, they were wanting to see the fulfillment of all of these prophecies and to study the Bible. So what we said, we got on the radio, I think you mentioned that, with Ron Engelman.
James Tabor, let me just do some radio housekeeping work that I have to do by re-identifying what we're doing and who we are. This is Letters of Politics, and we are in conversation with James Tabor. James Tabor is a biblical scholar, a retired professor of Christian origins and ancient Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is the co-author of the book, Why Waco, Cults and the Battle for Religious Freedom. Again, James Tabor, I want to get and hear about your experience along with, as you were mentioning, Philip Arnold, who was also a religious scholar. You two went to Waco, tried to.
No, what actually I didn't go. I stayed in Charlotte. We worked virtually, and what we did. Arnold went on the radio before I went with him. He did it as early as I think April. During March, and the Davidians started asking to talk to him because he is a very knowledgeable person on the Bible. And I think what they said is send him in, and the idea would be Koresh will be able to show Arnold that he doesn't know anything, and then they can all be reinforced, you know, that this is the guy. So we kind of took him up on that in the sense that Philip and I are communicating all the time since day one, but I didn't need to go down there because you can't do anything. You just be in a hotel room. But we were able to get in touch with Dick DeGuerin, the lawyer who was going in, seeing Koresh, working out the legal arrangements for a surrender. And that was all done. Who'll come out first? Who'll come out second? Texas Rangers will handle it, not the feds, and so forth. So that was all arranged. And we went on a show on March the 1st, Ron Engelman's show in Dallas. And what we did is we basically talked to Koresh over the radio. I'm talking to Phil, he's talking to me, and we're basically in the hearing of David.
And this is the same radio station. This is the same radio station that David Koresh would go on himself to talk?
Yes, he was on it some, but actually the one that he went on to give his major broadcast on March 1st was a Christian station. And that's another kind of subject we probably can't get into given our time limit. But anyway, they took our tape in. David didn't hear it live. And Phil played it for DeGuerin, and DeGuerin said, I have to take this in. Because he said, I've solved the legal thing, but I have to show the people that if they come out, that the message will be dealt with as well, not just like you shot federal agents and you're going to get thrown in jail. So what we proposed to him was right from Revelation 10. We said, basically, David, before the 28th, nobody heard of you. Now the whole world knows you. But guess what they know you as? A gun-toting Messiah Christ who claims to, bring on the end of the world and all of this kind of thing. They don't really know what you're teaching. They don't know why the people are there. Why don't you write your message? Write the 7 seals in short form, and then come out. And if you give a copy to us, we will take it to the scholars, the biblical scholars, the major biblical scholars of the country, because we have an annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, and we'll present it there. As a paper that this is, the Waco thing was recently solved, and this is the view of the leader, and there would be great interest in it and so forth. And he went for it. And he says, after Passover, I'll give you my word, Passover was like the first week or so of April. And the FBI thought Passover was one day. Obviously, there weren't many Jews in the group because Passover lasts 8 days. And true to form, the day after Passover, April 14th, he sent out a letter. I've got it right here. It's addressed to his lawyer. This is a copy, of course. I don't have the original. The government has that. And I won't read it all. We don't have time to read every word of it. But he basically says, I've been permitted to write the decoded message of the seven seals. God had told him to wait, and now he's saying I can do it. And let me just turn to it here. And what he says, I got a whole pack of letters, but I want to read a line or two from April 14th. I was shown that as soon as I'm given over to the hands of men, I will be made a spectacle of, and people will not be concerned about the truth of God, but just the bizarrety of him in the flesh. And that's what we told him. They're going to go, did you beat babies? How many wives do you have? And so forth. He says, I thank my Father. He's finally granted me the chance to do this. And then he says, I will demand the first manuscript of the seals be given to you. That's the lawyer. Many scholars and religious leaders will wish to have copies. I'll keep a copy with me. As soon as I can see that people like Jim Tabor and Phil Arnold have a copy, I will come out and you can do your thing with this beast. So you can see his rhetoric there. And he started writing it. This is it. After he was dead, we got the disc. This is the first seal. It is how many pages? Let's see, because I wrote a commentary on it. It's 13 pages. He wrote that in 2 days. So let's say, and the first seal is the longest seal. The others are actually pretty short. I think he could have finished in 2 weeks at the most, and he would have come out, I believe. It was all worked out for him. And Dick DeGuerin had convinced him, the lawyer, that he had a good case for self-defense in terms of who shot first and so forth. The metal door that disappeared that had the incoming rounds that now is not, nobody knows where it is. The film footage that was taken across the road by the BATF, they said, well, the camera didn't work, which seems unlikely. Sorry to be suspicious, but anyway. So that was the plan. And I just want to say, because, statutory rape, treatment of children, that comes under other jurisdictions. And there had been investigations of the Davidians for charges of child abuse, and they had actually been cleared by the Texas Family Services Department, whatever they're exactly called. But this gun thing is a big thing. People say they were hoarding weapons. They never had guns. Even when David was there through the 80s, they never had guns. They weren't storing any guns. Like any Texan, they had maybe a few rifles around for, you're out in the country, you need guns in Texas. But they began doing guns because a gun leader in Waco, Henry McMahon, said, the feds are going to change the gun laws soon and start outlawing these automatic weapons, semi and fully automatic weapons, which they did finally. And so if you will work with me and buy these weapons, take them to the gun shows, you've got the capital, because he did have money that people had donated to the group. You can make a lot. And so the weapons that they had were really the stock of of Henry McMahon, who was the arms dealer. In fact, the BATF came out there and talked to him, and he testified before Congress. And he said they came in and he said, yeah, here's the papers. Here's what David has. Here's what I've sold him. Showed him all that. And then he said, hold it a minute. And he went to the back room and called Koresh while the BATF is in the front. This is before the raid. They're planning it. Planned it for over a year. And then he walks out with the phone. He says, hey, I've got him on the phone. He wants you to come out. He'll show you what he has. And they're like, no, that's not the plan. So that's very unfortunate. Now, they did find some weapons that had been converted. It wasn't clear to me whether it was this trigger kind of thing you can put on a weapon, or whether they were doing something inside the weapon to make it rapid fire. That came up recently in that the shooting in Nevada, in terms of what you can do to those weapons and should it be outlawed, these rapid triggers. But these were not illegal if you filled out the paperwork. And so it's really came down to a question of that. They certainly weren't illegal in Texas. So this idea that it's a brainwash, gun-hoarding cult that plans to do damage to people, I think simply doesn't hold up.
On April 19th, 1993, this is the second assault on the complex. This is when the buildings would be engulfed in fires, when more than 70 people would die, including a couple dozen children. But before that occurs, just before that occurs, maybe the day before, you and Philip Arnold are feeling pretty optimistic that this is going to come to an end peacefully.
Yes, we were. When we got that letter, April 14th, remember, that's just days before the fire on Monday the 19th. We were ecstatic. We were high-fiving over the phone, and I think we might have popped some champagne corks, and we were just, it's over. They're going to come out, these good people. The law, the courts will take care of it, and nobody else needs to die. And little did we know that the FBI was meeting with Janet Reno over that weekend to try to convince her to approve the CS gas assault and what followed. The idea would be that if you insert this gas into this building, that it'll be so painful. People call it tear gas. It's much worse than just common tear gas. It's actually outlawed, I think, by several countries for use in war because it's can be so damaging.
Chemical weapons.
And there are children in there. There are children in there as well, and women. And that they would come out. And Reno was against it. And she said, no, I don't think that's the way. But she was kind of pressured. But we now know that she was not told about the surrender plan.
You met with her after.
I met with her after. She came to speak at Charlotte. We had a short time after her speech. She'd read my book. And she said, if she kept asking, and this is in the government record too, is there any other way? What are other alternatives? And they said, look, he's lied. He's not coming out. He breaks his word all the time, which is not true. David did say on March 2nd, I'm coming out if you broadcast this certain radio program. But it didn't go very far. It was on a Christian network. He had in mind, getting to the whole world somehow. And then he felt that God told him to wait. And maybe thinking, I didn't finish telling you Revelation 10. It says after he eats the book, if he thinks it's him, it says you will prophesy again before many nations, kings, and rulers. So we had said, if he thinks he's this guy and he's got to fulfill this, then he doesn't need to die and they don't need to die. He needs to come out and tell us what his message was. We're listening. The world is listening. So I think it was an irresistible appeal. It really was. And I think he would have come out. And he would have had to face other charges eventually, maybe of statutory rape and so forth, and maybe he would have ended up convicted of that. Or polygamy, these are all legal matters. But as far as coming out, surrendering, and having the issue of what happened on February 28th solved, it could have been solved in the courts. But unfortunately, it wasn't. Now, I really encourage people, and I think you listen to this, I have a tape on my YouTube channel that I produced from the negotiation tapes. They are in the public domain. The last words of David Koresh. It is chilling to read because David is talking to the FBI agents on Saturday. Remember, the assault is on Monday. He is so optimistic. He is so up. He's joking with the agents. One of the agents, I've got it written down, his name is Dick. It was on the 16th, I believe. Yeah, 16th. He says, "Hey, Dick, good to talk to you. Did you take a shower for me?" It's that kind of banter back and forth. And David said, "I'm so tired of these MREs. First thing I'm going to eat when I go to jail is a pizza with everything on it." This kind of thing, this kind of talk. And then they got down to business, and he said, "Well, David, let's talk about this." He said, "It's going to knock your socks off." He said, "This truth has never been given to the world." He was so excited. I mean, I told Phil, I said, "I live in North Carolina. Billy Graham is an hour and a half, 2 hours from where I live." I would have given it to Billy Graham. I would have called him and said, you could help here if we can say to him that, once he's surrendered and all that you're going to look at it. Somebody of that stature and that respect. It was so appealing to him, and unfortunately, Reno wasn't told that. So what they did is they delivered to the Davidians the apocalypse. That's what they did. I mean, look at the pictures. Tanks and flames and fire and CS gas and military equipment. And whether the FBI shot or not is some people think there are FLIR tapes and footage that show that people at the back were shooting. I'm not convinced on that myself, but I feel my job is to talk about how it could have ended peacefully without further loss of life, not to judge all the ins and outs of the siege. That's something that different agencies have tried to do and different programs are still investigating. But to me, it could have ended peacefully. So
you feel passionately about this 30 years later.
Oh yeah. Well, I've gotten to know the people that survived, and all the Davidians weren't even in there, and I've met them and I've become friends with them. And of course, watching those, I got the video with the 19 people, and most of them are dead. And I could name most of the children and something about them. I go to the memorials where the survivors gather, and they read the names of the ATF agents as well and talk about them and how unnecessary it was. The whole point is the FBI called this a hostage barricade situation, and they voted or decided for a dynamic entry. That's where you're in bed one night and all of a sudden you feel your door being beaten down, and some federal agents start screaming through the house, "We're FBI or whatever, and we have a warrant," how many times has that ended well? Maybe it's necessary, maybe it's not. But, there are other examples of this that have been brought out, like in the film Waco, The Rules of Engagement and so forth, where these Randy Weaver, just a couple of years before Waco, remember up in Idaho, when Randy Weaver and his family, he was accused of sawing off a shotgun to an illegal length. And his wife ends up killed, and I think I can't remember, but his son and his wife were definitely killed. I think the baby, she was holding the baby might have survived, and he was sold the gun by a federal agent. So it was literally a scheme to get him to go for this weapon, and he was a guy up in the mountains that wanted to be left alone and so forth. We got a lot of these people in the country. By the way, Mitch, after Waco, do you remember the Montana Freemen, they're called? They surrendered peacefully, and Arnold was up there with Gary Neusner, the FBI agent that we feel was the best negotiator.
Philip Arnold, your partner at the time.
Philip Arnold. Arnold was up there involved in that, and it was resolved peacefully by thinking about their belief system. In other words, if a group thinks that they're the last days group, their leader is the final prophet, and they're in there waiting for the end, and then you bring an attack on them,
you're fulfilling it.
And finally, the final attack, what are they going to think? They're going to think the apocalypse is here. But how do you, I sometimes joke, how you make an apocalyptic group sort of sit down and give up? Bore them to death. Apocalypticism thrives on crisis, like something major happening. But if nothing happens, then it's just hot Texas weather with summer coming on. But they did all kinds of things, like basically psych ops, blinding lights, crazy music all night long, sleep deprivation. Does that make Davidians, if they were sincere, and I believe they were, oh yeah, let's go out to those people. Let's turn our children over to them, because they were taught that these are the forces of what they call Babylon. The beast of Revelation is the federal government. Not all the federal government, but this sort of armed approach to things. So yeah, I am passionate about it, and I'm mostly passionate now about not seeing it repeated. Now, the FBI has been meeting with religious studies scholars now for the past 30 years, and these meetings have been very productive. I think there's been a lot of revision of how you would approach a religious group. If somebody's holed up at a McDonald's because of some kind of domestic trouble and is threatening to shoot hostages or something, then yeah, you got a hostage barricade situation. But the Davidians would say, this was our home. Who's hostage? Nobody's hostage. We live here and you attacked us. That was their view. And I think it's a valid view from their perspective. So how should it have been handled? Jack Harwell, the sheriff, or a Texas Ranger should have gone out with the BATF and talked to David and inspected the weapons. And people say, well, he wouldn't have shown them all. There's an inventory and the gun dealer would have gone too. Go out there and have a powwow and just talk about it. And it could have been solved so easily. And if David had anything illegal, he could you fill out paperwork when you convert these semi-automatics. It's a thing that you have to. It's a fee you pay, and you figure out, and then they can be sold at gun shows. They still are today, in Texas, I believe. So that's kind of the story. It's just a double, triple, quadruple tragedy in my view, and it just shouldn't have happened. And I feel terrible about the ATF agents. I mean, they were just doing what they were told to do, and those guys that were killed as well and their families. Unnecessary. That would be my word for the whole thing. Unnecessary.
James Tabor has been our guest. James Tabor is a biblical scholar, retired professor of Christian origins and ancient Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is the co-author of the book, Why Waco? Cults and the Battle for Religious Freedom in America. You can find more of his work online at jamestabor.com. You could also find his YouTube page where he has many videos about this very subject.